All right, let's go ahead and we'll get started. Last one talking says the prayer. I teach at BYU Idaho too much. Okay, today we are going to learn how to function. We're going to write functions. Functions are super important. This is how you make money writing code, right? Yeah, many of you have approached me and you're like, hey Ben, I found some code on the internet that does the assignment. Can I just use that for the assignment? The answer has always been no, because you're here to learn programming. But when you become a software developer, if you can find code that is accomplishing the thing that you are trying to do, you should use it, right? Because it will save your company money. You'll get your stuff done faster. Okay, well-named functions, functions that do what you would like them to do, are how people like, I don't know, they're like people who generate PDFs, who give you software to generate PDFs from a computer program that you write. They will probably have a function like create PDF that takes a file name and a stream of data. Anyway, if you can write a good function and you can get someone to help you ship it, you can make money writing code, right? Also, when you become a developer, when it's time to divide up the work, you're going to be on a team. When it comes time to divide up a work, this is how teams divide up work. They say, you write a function to do such and such a thing, and then I will use it in my function, and so on, right? So this is a way that we bundle code together in such a way that other people can use it, all right? And we're going to talk exactly about what that means. We have been using functions since day one. This right here is a function, right? Everyone has had this in every program they've written so far. This function has a couple different parts, and these parts I've outlined on the wiki. Wiki. Let's just go through them real quick. So I've got creating functions and calling functions is what we're going to talk about to begin with. So creating functions, there are several parts to a function. First off, there's a function header. There's then a function body, and the header has multiple parts, okay? All functions have a name, right? This should be a descriptive name that describes what the statements in the function do. Whoever's job it was to tell me to zoom in, you have failed, please leave. Okay. For example, this function's name is main. It has to be main because that's how console applications work. The entry point to our program is the function called main, right? But I can create a function and name it anything I want. For example, Austin did not tell me to zoom in, right? And that's a valid function name. There you go. Right, but this probably doesn't give me a lot of information about what the function does. So it's a good idea to make your function names meaningful. For example, if I were to show you the name of a function like get input from user, what would you expect this function to do? Collect data, right? Specifically from a user. Even better, right? This gives you more information about what this function will do. So a function name, it can be anything you want. One thing to note is function names do not have to be unique. Variable names have to be unique, right? In the same scope. A way we can get around this is if the next part of the function header is different, which is the parameter list. This is totally valid, okay? The parameter list is inside parentheses. It is immediately after the function name. It can have 0 parameters, or it can have as many parameters as you'd like. Okay, the parameters are the inputs for your function, right? If you want me to get input from user via console, maybe I'm going to require that you give me an output message or a question to ask. Right, so these are the things, the pieces of data that I need for my function to work. We just saw up here, if you were paying attention before the session started, we had a function called sum, right? And that had two parameters, right? So we've got a function named sum that accepts two parameters. What would you expect this function to do without reading line 25? Everyone look away. Just kidding, you don't. I heard it in the back. It was a faint whisper on the wind. Add the two numbers. Exactly right. So in order to sum, I need two numbers to sum. It probably doesn't make a lot of sense to call a function to sum two numbers or any amount of numbers and then not provide any numbers, right? Add.
1 plus 1.
No. I mean, you could do that, right? You could have a function that sums 1 plus 1. Right, but this isn't a very flexible function. What happens when I tell you the new requirement is that it's 2 plus 2? You have to go change it, right? So a good function will have a parameter list. You can have as many parameters here as you want, but if you make a function that requires many parameters, no one will pay you money for your function because it will be terrible to use. I'm just going to do this till someone says stop.
Stop.
Okay, thank you.
One more letter. One more letter.
Not like number 7.
Okay. Any questions about function name or parameter list? I think I mentioned it. I'll mention again. The parameter list can be empty. Right? We don't have to have parameters. But if you want to do something in your function and require input, use parameters. Okay? So a function has a name, it has a parameter list, and it has a return type. Okay? A function is supposed to do stuff, and then it's supposed to hand you back a piece of data. So the return type comes before the function name. You can see that the return type of this function is an int. Right? So this is going to return me a single value. It's going to be a number. It's going to be an int. I'll bring back my parameter list here. Okay. The way, so yeah. This function, I know without looking at any of the function body, I know that it's a summing function that takes two numbers and returns a number. So I can probably infer quite a bit just by looking at the function header, right? If I don't have access to look at the function, and I'm coming, well, I won't talk about this right now. All right, just know that a function for the most part returns a single value. It could return an int array if I wanted, so it would return multiple values, but really it's still just returning one variable. Okay? And it's not required to return a value. If you don't want to return a value, you use the keyword void. Okay, void just says my function isn't a function that will hand you back a piece of data. It just does a thing and goes on its way. Any questions about the return type of functions? I'll talk about the return keyword here in a minute, but just specifically about the return type. Could be bool, could be string, just any of the data types that we've learned. If you don't want your function to return a piece of data, void. Okay. Next is the function body. So we have learned that curly braces are kind of like our containers or our groupers, right? When we did if statements, we grouped if statements with curly braces. When we did loops, we grouped the statements to be repeated with curly braces, and with functions, we grouped the lines of code that belong to the function with curly braces, okay? Any code that is inside the curly braces immediately following a function header is part of the function body. Right? So this is the third time we've used these groupers. Hopefully this is becoming a little more familiar to you. Use opening and closing curly braces to define the function body. Now inside of the function body, you should see 0 or more return keywords, okay? The return keyword basically signals an exit point for our function, okay? When the type is void, when the return type is void, we don't have to return any data. But when we have said we will hand you back an int when you use our function, we have to say return and then an int value. All right, this is the world's worst function right now. It's called sum. It takes in 2 numbers, but always returns 5. Right? So this is like addition with a preschooler. What's 3 plus 3? 5. Yeah. All right. So the return keyword, when the return type is not void, has to return a value, but when it is void, it cannot return a value, right? Because that's what we've said. This function doesn't return a value, void, right? So if there were any code after this statement, Visual Studio would start yelling at us and saying, basically, you've told me on line 25 that this function is done and execution stops in the function, but then you added a piece of code here and Visual Studio says this is unreachable code, meaning when it's time to run your code, if this function is called, this line of code will never, ever, 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 ever execute, okay? So anything after a return statement will not be considered, except there can be multiple exit points for our function. Again, returning to the world's worst function, okay? So right here you can see that I have 2 return statements, and you are probably thinking to yourself, but Ben, if we hit a return statement, any code after the fact will not be run. This return statement will only be executed if num1 is greater than 5. So there is a chance that we would never enter this if statement and never get to this return statement, so we will always hit this one, okay? You can have as many return statements in your function as possible. You can't have, I mean, they have to be conditionally reached, right? Different paths of code. This is an error. Again, unreachable code detected. Do you have any questions at this point? Austin.
So return always goes back up all the way to your static int, or doesn't it go back up one bracket? So
We
it
will
go back up to
we'll talk about that in 45 seconds. So the question was, where does execution go when a line of code with return is encountered? And we'll talk about that so soon. All right, that is creating functions. And now I'm going to wait for 27 seconds so that my prophecy will come true that we'll talk about. I'm just kidding. There are places where we use our functions, and they are called function call sites, okay? There are several things that need to happen when you want to call a function. I have just created this function, and I'm going to back out all of this really bad code here. All right, now this function does what I want it. When I want to call a function, I need to do several things. Very first, I need to call the function by its name, right? What's the name of this function? Sum, correct. So if I want to call this function in another part of my code, I need to call it by name. Okay, and right now, Visual Studio is yelling at me saying, you are not providing what the function requires, basically, right? The function said, if you want to call sum, you need to provide 2 numbers, and you're going to call them num1 and num2. All right, but I didn't provide any numbers up here. When I'm providing numbers or values up here, they are no longer called parameters, they're called arguments, right? I have an argument that fills a parameter. An argument is an actual value, a parameter is a template that will hold an actual value. When you add arguments, they need to be comma separated. I don't think I mentioned that, but when you add parameters, there needs to be a comma in between each parameter. Okay, same deal with arguments. So when we call a function, we need to call it by name, and we need to provide arguments to fill the parameters of the function. Okay, another thing that is important when we are calling a function is this function is going to return us a piece of data. Does anyone remember what piece of data it's going to return us? I changed it back.
Return 3.
So right now, given arguments 1 and 2, it's going to return 3. I can take what that function gives me back and store it in a variable. Okay? So this is how my program is going to run. It enters on line 8 because main is the entry point for the program, comes down here to line 10, and it says, oh, you're telling me to call a function. I'm going to go find this function, and execution goes from line 10 down to line 23, executes all of these statements, and jumps back from line 25 back to the call site. Right? But now it's handing me back a value. I handed it 2 values. It's handing me back 1 value. What will be stored in the sum after line 10 is done executing? 3. Exactly right. Or alien peace sign. All right, that's function call site right there. So we supplied an argument and we stored the return value. Last thing I want to talk about, well, first off, are there any questions at this point? Okay. So what if I told you inception, right? You can nest function calls within each other. This is going to get crazy, all right? Right here, I'm providing a number and a number. I'm providing arguments to fill a parameter list. But what if I call the function inside of the function call? What happens here? So what happens is we go to the innermost function and then we go left to right. So the innermost function call is right here. We execute this. We jump down to line 23. We perform the sum and return 3. Then the next innermost right here, jump down, do the sum, jump back up, 3. And then we've got 3 and 3. We go to the outermost function and we are summing 3 and 3, and 6 is stored in the sum. Little do you know, we have been doing this pretty much all session long. When we do this, we've got a function call within a function call within a function call. All right, so what happens first is we read input from the console that the user typed. That's the innermost function call. Then we convert that input to a number. That's the second layer of funcception. And then we go to the outermost function call and we write that out to the console. Okay? So you can nest function calls. Does anyone have any questions about this?
So I'm not sure, doesn't right line convert what you give it to a string anyway? Okay, so the convert to the in32 is never really necessary. Okay, now it is. Okay, never mind.
So my question is less intriguing, but my question is, how come it's not an infinite loop? Because int the sum is getting number plus number, and then it stops. So somehow in this program, it knows to stop instead of running it over and over and over and over.
So the question is, why isn't line 10 causing an execution loop, an infinite loop? And the answer is, we are calling this function exactly 3 times, okay? We call it once right here. So we jump down to line 23, then we jump back up, and instead of sum and arguments 1 and 2, you could replace that with the value 3. Okay, so static value, we've called the function, it's returned, that happens 1 time. Do it again. Then you could replace this function call with a value 3, and then we call it one more time, passing it 3 and 3, and then we're done, right? So when you call a function, it's only called once.
So it looks
So we
to
call it
me-
once here, call it once here, call it another time here.
I think the answer for my question would be the parentheses stops the infinite loop. The parentheses are what kind of set a limitation.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Can you call a function from within itself?
Yes,
That great infinite loop?
that is forbidden.
Okay.
That's a topic called recursion. That's not something we'll cover here. It's something that if you ever take like a university programming class, they will teach it to you and you'll be like, wow, that was really hard. And then you'll never use it ever. So, yeah. Yeah, it's a very difficult concept. Yeah, for a good time, Google Fibonacci sequence, C# recursion, and you'll see functions that call themselves. Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. All right, let's do some coding practice. I'm going to do a code along up here, and then we will get to our coding assignments. So what I would like to do is delete everything. Delete, delete, delete. Okay. I'm going to create a program that does our times tables, but I'm going to use several functions, right? So very first, I'm going to create a function called getInputFromUser. Can someone tell me what the name of this function is? I guess I just said it, didn't I? Can someone repeat back everything I'm saying? GetInputFromUser. What is the, are there any parameters for this function?
Yes.
What is the name of the parameter?
Display message.
Very good. And what is the return type for this function? String. Okay. Right now, Visual Studio is yelling at me saying, hey, you told me that you would return a string, but not all code paths return a value. So what gives, bruh? So let's go ahead and make sure we return a string. All right. So the purpose of this function is to get input from the user. So very first, I'm going to say, all right, I require a display message when you want input. So I'm going to write out to the console the display message that you handed me when you called me. And then I'm going to read in the input. And then I'm just going to return the input. Okay. So here is a function. I am now going to use this function so much. All right. I'm going to call this function. I'm going to say get input from user. And I have to hand it a what when I'm calling this function? Starts with an A. It's not a sandwich. Argument, right? An actual value to fill the template that the function header dictates. Okay, so this is a display message. Please enter a number. Exclamation point. Okay. What's the return type of get input from user? And where am I storing it up here on line 10? Be quiet, Eric Tang. Be quiet. Nowhere. Okay, I'm going to store it in int the number. All right, what's going on? Why are you mad at me, Visual Studio? Can someone tell me without me telling you? Exactly right. I have said the get input from user function returns a string, and I'm trying to restore the store the return of that function in an int variable. Not going to happen. Okay. I have fixed my error, and now I can do multiplication, right? Wrong. I need a function to convert this string into a number. So I'm going to do, if I need a function to convert a string to a number safely, what should I call it? Okay. If I want to convert to number, what should the return type for my function be? Very good. And if I want to convert to number, I probably need some input. So what parameters should I say are required when calling this function?
The number.
Not a strong, but a string. Okay.
Oh my gosh.
Oops. All right, you might ask, well, why did you create a function just to do this? And because maybe later I want to add in some logic here to say if you handed me a string that can't be converted to a number, I want to display a friendly message like, hey guy, try again, or something like that. I don't know. Right? So I am actually now going to do a nested function call. So what's my issue now? Cannot implicitly convert type int to string. So even though I'm calling this function that returns a string, it happens before I call this function that returns a number. So now the return of my outermost function is a number. I need to store it as a number. Any questions? Okay. Now it's time to party. All right, let's create the times table, right? I want to write out messages like calling a function here. The number plus the multiplier sign plus 1 equals the number times 1, right? I want to do this for all the numbers. Everybody get what I'm trying to do here? Trying to build a multiplication table. I need to do this for a specified number of numbers. So maybe I should ask the user how many numbers they would like to be included in the multiplication table. So I'm going to do this again. Int multiplication table num. And I'm actually going to call get input from user again. How many numbers in the multiplication table? Okay, and I need to convert that to a number again. All right, you can see now that we've called the get input from user function twice, the convert to number function twice, right? We're reusing code and we're putting a fancy name on that code. We're making it a little easier for us. Formerly, we would have had to write 2 console.writeLine statements and 2 console.readLine statements, but now we've just written them once and we're reusing that code, right? Okay, what's next? I want to do a loop. Oh yeah, is that okay? Is that okay for everyone in the back? Looking for any signs of life in the back? Anyone? Darren, show me your laptop screen right now. Just kidding. Okay, got it. Okay, let's loop. Let's create our so I'll replace my hard-coded 1 with I. Okay. And I'll delete this. So let's talk about how this program is going to execute. Call it out for me on line numbers, okay? We start on line 8, line 9, line 10, then where? Down to line 24, yep. Then we execute this whole function, and then where?
Back up to 19, or it goes back to 10 and then.
Back to 10, and then we jump down to 19, execute everything here, then we jump back up, and we do it all again. Let's run this. Any predictions on the output here? Okay. There you go. Does anyone have any questions about this program and using functions at all before we jump into our coding assignments? Okay. Here are your coding assignments. Should not have been indented. I don't know what's going on here. Live editing of the wiki. All right. I've got an easy and a medium program for you today. All right. So the easy program should accept an integer array, and it should return the sum of all the integers in the array, right? So you will need to create a function called sumAll. What should be accepted as a parameter? You should accept an integer array as a parameter, right? And what should the return type of sumAll be? An integer, right? So what this function should do is loop through the array and sum all the numbers in the array and return back the sum. And then I want you to call that function from the main function and produce a sentence. So if I passed in an array that contained 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, the sentence would say something like the sum of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is 21. Sure hope that math's right. Okay. The medium difficulty function is, you're going to create a function called getDigit. It's going to take in 2 parameters, a number and an index. Okay. getDigit should extract a single digit from a specified number at the specified index, right? So if I pass in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 to getDigit as well as 1, what number should be returned from getDigit? If the index is 1 in the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, it's actually 2. Index 1 is the second place, remember, because indexes are 0-based, right? So I want you to create 2 functions, getDigit that extracts a single digit from a specified number at a specified index, and then another function called sumNumber that accepts a number. SumNumber should call getDigit for every space in a number, for every digit in a number, and then sumNumber should sum up the number. So if I pass in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, the console should end up displaying 45. Does anyone have any questions before we dive in? Okay. Let's party.